Welcome to Human Rights Education Now, a podcast series from Human Rights Educators USA. I'm your host, Bill Fernikes, a member of the National Steering Committee of HRE USA, a collaborative network to learn, teach, organize, advocate, and innovate for human rights education in the United States. This podcast aims to raise awareness about human rights education and invites listeners to engage with the worldwide movement to make human rights education a core focus of educational programs from preschool through higher education and in both non-formal and informal community educational settings. Today's program is a conversation with Monisha Bajaj, Professor of International and Multicultural Education at the University of San Francisco and Editor-in-Chief of the International Journal of Human Rights Education. In this episode, Monisha discusses the origins of her interest in human rights and peace education, the evolution of human rights education as a field of inquiry, core concepts uniting the fields of human rights education and peace education, the development of the graduate program in human rights education at the University of San Francisco, and how students in the program have incorporated HRE into their daily practice. Well, it's a great pleasure to be conversing today with Monisha Bajaj. How are you today, Monisha?
I'm doing well. Nice to see you.
You've been involved in human rights education for some time, so can you tell us about how you first became interested in human rights and subsequently in HRE?
Sure. Well, I guess I can trace it back to it was during college. I majored in sociology, and we had a program where you could add on a year and get a master's. So I got a master's in Latin American and Caribbean studies. I had been doing research in Haiti and the Dominican Republic. So had been taking courses on human rights. At that time, Haiti was transitioning to democracy for the first time after the military coup. I had written about that in my thesis. I had visited several times and was really excited about human rights as a field. And so my first job after college that I got was to be an associate, which is kind of like the lowest rung of the organization at Human Rights Watch in Washington, D.C. So I went from always having kind of grown up and been raised in California to D.C., to the heart of advocacy and, the NGO type world, working at one of the leading human rights organizations. And it was almost like a second master's, the 2 years that I worked there, just really being at the forefront of one of these organizations, obviously learning from the inside, you learn a lot of things. And what I saw is that, definitely the legal strategies and the sort of media strategies were at the forefront, as is really important. But what I learned during that time, and at that time I was reading Pedagogy of the Oppressed with a friend. We would read and talk about it. And during the day I was working at Human Rights Watch and really, talking to victims on the phone, thinking about media strategies, helping my colleagues, set up meetings with heads of government to pressure them on human rights issues. And I was trying to make sense of these two things, reading Paolo Freire, for really kind of reading that book fully in its entirety for the first time and working, day in, day out at a leading human rights organization. And one of my colleagues knew someone by the name of Peirre, Claude, who also lived in DC and is one of the founding fathers of our field of human rights education. And this person connected us. And I spent, this was when we still had Hotmail and the internet wasn't what it is now. And so I went over to Professor Claude's office and, sat with him for several hours. He was doing trainings for democracy activists in the Philippines. And he shared a bunch of photocopies of materials because that's what we shared back in the day. And just got me really interested in this very emerging field at that point of human rights education. This was in the mid to late 90s, and it was during the UN decade. So that really sparked an interest in me to kind of figure out my place in this field that wasn't quite yet a field, but a lot of people were putting energy towards, and it was sort of an emerging field at that time. And then from there, I went on to design a project, an independent research project that I did a Fulbright around. And then I thought, to work in a field that doesn't quite exist, getting a doctorate seems like the right way to be able to insert oneself and create a way to do research and think and advance this field.
So you went to Teachers College, Columbia, is that correct?
Yeah. So then after a couple of years later, after I had met Professor Claude, I was looking for the right doctoral program, and the Teachers College had an international education doctoral program with a focus on peace education. And at that time, Betty Reardon was talking about peace and human rights together, really more from the peace education perspective, but it seemed like the best aligned doctoral program for the kind of work that I wanted to do.
So if you compare where you were when you started your interest in this in the 90s to where it is today, what have been sort of the major changes or developments you feel have occurred in the field?
So many. So in terms of thinking about, this plus minus 3 decades that I've been involved, I mean, just the amount of people talking about human rights education, the growth that the internet has provided for networking, resources to be shared, UN conversations, NGO conversations, and just, I think at that time, it was harder for, it did happen that NGOs, non-governmental organizations could connect across borders, but it was harder now that we have, so many technologies, what we're talking on today, internet technologies like Zoom and, email and connections across, there's not a lag. We can connect and strategize and organize in real time. So I think the spread, both at the government level and then the NGO level, of what human rights education is, what it isn't, who's opting into this framework, who's opting out, and for what reasons. We just have a more robust sense of that. And then just definitely more scholarship. We have 2 journals in the field now. We have many books. We have doctoral dissertations at University of San Francisco. We have the first Masters of Arts in Human Rights Education. We have a doctoral concentration. And I think more voices from the global South, for sure. When I first started, I think it was a lot of kind of global North experts going to places in the global South to share expertise. Now it feels like there's much more leadership and participation and contribution that's a little more egalitarian in that way.
Do you believe that at this time, 2023, there are theoretical challenges that, or debates, for example, that you feel are very prominent in the field?
I mean, I think what the challenge I see is that I think, in the 90s, you had, kind of coming off the fall of the Berlin Wall, there was this kind of consensus around democracy, human rights, in a way that now I feel like with rising fascism in different places and in different ways, the question of, is human rights even valid, is something that we're having to contend with, where for some of the time that I've been in the field, I feel like there was a question, you didn't have everybody on board, but there was a value on human rights. I feel like that is coming into question a bit more now, as we see so many gross violations of human rights by different authoritarian regimes, in the name of development, or in the name of top-down rule, or what have you. I don't know if that's a theoretical challenge, but I think it requires us to think of our theoretical frameworks without assuming that everyone values human rights or human rights education. So that, I think, poses a question to scholars, to really interrogate some of the things that we took as foundational or you took as assumptions earlier on in the field.
I mean, one of the challenges I see, and you've alluded to it, is the critique of, you might say, more traditional global North conceptions of human rights. Can you talk a little more about that argument or that debate?
Sure. I mean, I think there's some great scholarship by scholars like Andre Keats, Michaelinos Zambilas, scholarship that's coming from places where they're, resisting this declarationist approach of, here's a declaration, let's just teach about it. Like, that's a more simplistic form of human rights education, to just assume that these declarations don't have baked in inequalities and exclusionary practices. We actually just talked about this in my class last week. I teach a class on human rights education, history, philosophy, and debates for our master's and doctoral students. And we looked at who was at the table in 1945 to 48 when the UDHR was being discussed and debated and argued over every comma and every article. There were 58 nations in the UN at that time. Now there's 193. So, 195, depending on how you count Palestine and the Holy See. But in terms of thinking about who was part of those discussions and what might they have missed in their perspectives, and, thinking about these frameworks as evolving and growing, and how they best serve the people who are charged with taking these into practice and on the ground, really linking them to the realities that people face outside of the halls of the UN or governments.
And what about the movement and scholarship to discuss decolonization, and how does that have an impact on human rights education?
Yeah, I mean, I think it has a great impact. We started a journal 7 years ago at the University of San Francisco. It's an open access online journal, the International Journal of Human Rights Education, and we just did an issue on decolonial human rights education. I think it was last year or the year before, and we had some great perspectives about how we take these ideas, out of the realm where they've been sort of infused with these Eurocentric logics of sort of modernity and kind of colonial legacies in education, and how do we make them meaningful and use them in ways that don't just reinforce the ways that a lot of educations were set up to kind of dominate, subjugate, and get people to just kind of accept inequalities and forces of oppression. So I think there's some good voices on that. And I think, you have both political decolonization, which is, nation states fighting for independence and achieving that and setting up their own systems. And then you have the ideas around decolonizing education and indigenizing and really questioning some of these logics and norms. And so we can look at it both in the political sphere and then this project of, continually aspiring to get better in the ways that we approach our work through a decolonizing lens. And it may, it's a constant in process, just like anti-racist work. It's always in process. You don't reach a destination. We're always kind of doing better and thinking about it. And I think, something I encourage my students to do is think about, looking at Indigenous ways of understanding rights and looking at ways that Global South communities use these frameworks. Why are they using them? What do you gain from using it? And the book that I wrote about 11 years ago now, Schooling for Social Change, which was focused on human rights education in India, what I really liked about the organizations that I partnered with for that research is that they were opting in intentionally to human rights education as a framework because it allowed them to be part of a global community and global conversation, but that also had meaning locally and that allowed them to make demands from the government about what should be included in education for some of the most marginalized communities.
And I think it would be fair to say that decolonization isn't just an external issue. In other words, you can look at indigenous communities in the United States, the people in Canada can look at them in Canada, and that whole process of exploitation that's taken place over centuries is another important field, I would argue.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah, and I think that historical framework and analysis is really useful. I think we can't look at the moment and think about human rights or human rights education without understanding where we've come. And I think some of those forces of reconciliation, acknowledging past harm, some of the discussions about reparative futures, they really inform the way that we need to be thinking about the field as well.
So you've written extensively about the connections between human rights education and peace education. Can you discuss some of those critical concepts and how do you sort of integrate them in your own work?
Yeah. Well, I think this came out of conversations over the past probably 2 decades that I've been working with my colleague, Maria Hansopoulos. She was somebody I met who was also in the peace education concentration of the doctoral program. She came a couple years after me. And both of us have been really rooted in peace education, but also writing and researching in the field of human rights education and really feeling that these the way that academia creates these silos and, you become an expert in your own little domain has nothing to do with another field or domain. And that oftentimes there's a lot of parallels, there's a lot of overlap, there's a lot of conceptual intersection, but because of the way sort of traditional academia is set up, people just kind of root in and ground down in one aspect. So what we've been trying to do as we've been, both of us really, rooted our dissertations in the field of peace and human rights education to a certain degree, and then really thinking about the intersections between these fields. And Maria and I have written a couple books together. The most recent one came out in 2021. It's called Educating for Peace and Human Rights, an Introduction. And it's really meant to be a textbook for the students, the kind of students that we have in our classes, and students who around the world who may be interested in these fields and want to understand, they came up very, very similarly out of the post-World War II moment, a lot of emphasis on dialogue through the UN, a lot of people talking about peace and human rights education together, some people talking about them separately, of course, and kind of creating those fields on their own, but wanting to see what is the sort of mutual terrain, what's the shared terrain of these. And so in the book, we use kind of a heuristic of a tree, a possibility tree is what we call it, building on Paulo Freire's idea of the problem tree. We flip it and call it a possibility tree. And we talk about this shared terrain of concepts like dignity, transformative agency, justice, that really inform the critical and kind of transformative versions of both peace education and human rights education. Because what we see in practice is a lot of people doing very similar things out in the field to take these ideas out there. And a lot of these divisions really exist in the academic space where people are trying to sort of, quote unquote, colonize their own terrain of what they're an expert in. And so trying to link some of that practice back to the theorizing and the conceptualizing to really see where are these overlaps and how do we create kind of a shared basis for people to think about this intersection in a more robust way.
Now, you've, you've referenced Freire a couple of times. What is the legacy you feel he has, and how has his influence sort of marked your own work?
Very much so. I mean, my entrance to the field was really going deep into pedagogy of the oppressed and linking that to the field of human rights. And it's interesting, I'm showing my students on Saturday a clip from a new film by filmmaker Catherine Murphy about Paulo Freire. And I was looking at this documented footage that she's been able to access from Freire's first work before he was sent into exile and before he wrote Pedagogy of the Oppressed in Exile. It was his first literacy work I think it was in northeastern Brazil. And the kind of work that they were doing was all about human rights. They weren't calling it human rights education. But if you look at that footage, the people that he's working with are talking about being exposed to literacy in these adult literacy programs as a way to claim their right to vote. Because at that time, Brazil, like the US, maybe inspired by that, had literacy tests that would allow you to vote or not. And so having a large illiterate populace meant that politicians could control who got elected and who didn't. So they were very threatened by these efforts to educate rural, campesinos to figure out how to read and write. And so what I think is interesting is that there's been this connection between Freire's work and the field of human rights. But I think, and I do think in some of the work around popular education that I learned about in the 1990s, popular education roots very heavily in Paulo Freire's ideas. So I do think the most effective human rights education draws from the ideas of participatory, engaged, active citizenship dialogue. In my class, we do a little case study module on the work of Tostan in West Africa that uses generative images and themes, very similar to Freire's ideas, to get communities to come together and deliberate and dialogue around gender discrimination. And they have a lot of people who are not literate. So they use images, they don't use kind of written texts. And they've, had successes around getting increases to girls' education. They've had entire villages that have abandoned the practice of female genital cutting through these dialogues and discussions that they're able to bring in this very Freirean way. So to me, that is the most effective human rights education. And Paulo Freire's readings have really influenced the way that I approach education. Our program at USF was founded, our doctoral program was founded in the 1970s by colleagues of Paulo Freire. Some of our alums even talk about how they would write letters to Paulo Freire and he would write them back with advice on their dissertations in the olden days. We have some pictures of him in our hallway. And I think it's no coincidence that we're the first master's program in human rights education, the first doctoral concentration in a place so influenced by these ideas of critical pedagogy and pedagogies of marginalized groups.
So Freire came from a tradition of popular education in Latin America, which is pretty widespread in Latin America. But in the United States and other northern hemisphere countries, NGOs have had a very prominent role rather than necessarily a popular front movement. So what are some of the things you've done with NGOs and how have they informed your work?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think my time at Human Rights Watch, that's an NGO, was very instructive for me learning about kind of the global human rights movement. And then all of the research that I've done in the past, 25 years has been grounded in the work of NGOs. I usually partner with NGOs. The research is collaborative. We hash out, different dynamics around, this is research, this is not advertising for the NGO. Are you okay with the research being independent? Just making sure there's no misunderstandings about that. And, usually I've been able to find organizations that are self-reflective enough to want to engage in this type of collaborative process. And to me, that's really important because most of my research is in the global South. I'm coming from a university in the global North. I don't want to, reproduce, colonial relationships of extraction the way that often research has been done. In more recent years, I've been working with immigrant and refugee communities here in the Bay Area over the past decade. And that's been more with schools. So they're not NGOs, but really thinking about how to partner with schools, often that are under-resourced, often that are, doing work in some of the most dire circumstances of lack of funding and having populations that have severe trauma, some of these students, and a lot of needs. So to me, that collaboration is really important. And I think I wasn't somebody who always wanted to be an academic or, be a professor. I don't think I even knew anyone who was a professor till I was late in high school, that I even saw people in that role. And what really inspired me to want to go into academia was to use it as a platform. When I was in my doctoral program, I had professors like Leslie Bartlett, Fran Vavris, who were really engaged with communities, with organizations, and using research and mentoring grad students, leveraging the resources of universities and partnerships that could help really think about how to advance equity and justice in education through collaborative partnerships. So that's what drew me to the field, was the more kind of engaged, applied side of it. And I think that really informs how I've brought those perspectives to human rights and peace education.
So for some time now, you've directed the graduate program in human rights at the University of San Francisco. Can you talk a little bit about the goals of the program and what has been the impact on the daily practice of educators that you see?
Yeah. Yes, I have had this honor of directing the master's program and kind of being the head of the doctoral concentration over the past decade here at the University of San Francisco. The one thing that we have been trying to do for the better part of these 10 years that the program has existed is to have a credential attached to the master's in human rights education. Right now, it's not. And we have just faced a lot of hurdles in terms of the California requirements around credentialing and, figuring out how to give students what's happening is that there's a whole list of required courses that add up to a lot of units. And then to add, they won't let us substitute any of those requirements with human rights education. So it would be an add-on. So what students would have to do is take an additional 10 units to get the master's and get the credential, which is a lot of money. And teachers don't get paid that much. So that's where we've been running into some roadblocks. But that is still something we'd like to do. What we do have in the master's program is some people who have a credential but don't have a master's will come to the master's program so that they get that master's, or people who work in private schools who don't need the credential. We're a Jesuit institution, so we have a lot of Catholic school teachers in our program. And then we have a lot of people who work in NGOs, organizations, maybe work in after school programs in our master's program. And then our doctoral program, we have more people who are maybe student affairs professionals. We have people who are community college faculty. We just have a really diverse group of students. And something that I think has been really great, the doctoral concentration was started by my colleague, Susan Katz, and that's been around since 2000. Well, she started teaching classes in 2008, 2008, I believe. And then the concentration came a couple years after at the doctoral level. And then the master's program really started in 2013. And something that we've seen is just a lot more human rights dialogue. We have multiple people who graduated from the program in positions of power now and leadership in different organizations, and just the greater use of terms like human rights. Obviously, social justice education has a long legacy as well, but a lot of people just using this idea of human rights as central to education. That's something we've seen. The dissertations, the theses that our students have produced, a lot of times they'll do something that relates to where they're working, because our program meets in the evenings and on the weekends. So we get a lot of working professionals. So people will often develop their project, their research project related to the work they're doing and incorporating something related to human rights in that context. So we've seen that impact kind of locally. And then I would say, just in terms of thinking about the institution, we see, a greater presence of connection across the law school and the education school. And we had for many years a human rights film festival, just kind of these nodes of human rights across the university that are finding ways to connect in that way. What I think is really useful about the human rights framework, and especially in education in the last several years, is to be able to connect different forms of organizing, different forms of resistance to things. Immediately after Trump's election, what we saw was that, you had folks who were undocumented, very stressed about the policies that were coming in, and Muslim communities very stressed out about what was going to happen with, rightly so, because the types of discourse and policies were extremely awful. And, I think bringing together different communities thinking about human rights allows you to get out of like a single issue framework. And so when you can talk about how do we organize together around human rights, it gives you a larger framework to say, okay, here is different community groups. You have women's rights groups, you have immigrants' rights groups, you have people thinking about religious freedom, you have democracy activists, you have Black Lives Matter activists, you have people who can use a similar language and framework to connect struggles and think about how to work in solidarity to be more effective and powerful in the types of work that we're trying to do.
So to use an analogy, it's sort of a big tent approach.
I think so. And I think that is what's really useful about the human rights framework.
So one of the important issues for me as I've been going through these podcasts has been looking at the discourse in the United States, which tends to focus on things like civil rights or women's rights or disability rights, but not that broad framework. What do you think is a pathway forward to trying to reconceptualize that conversation? Instead of talking about civil rights, let's talk about healthcare as a human right, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I think that kind of siphoning and really has a long history in order to kind of disconnect us. And maybe I know there's an article, is it the work by Carol Anderson or I can't remember exactly, or Carl Grant has done some work around this to think about how these different movements strategically kind of diluted human rights in order to be more palatable, in order to get more possibilities for legislative wins. If we think about the history in the US in the 50s, immediately after the UDHR was adopted, you have people like W.E.B. Du Bois, Paul Robeson, William Patterson bringing a petition to the UN saying we charge genocide because of the way that African Americans are being treated in this country and the lynchings and the segregation. And they were laughed off the stage. Their passports were revoked. They were, red baited as communists and told that, their claims were meaningless in terms of the US's accountability for the types of things that they were naming as human rights violations. So I think there was a strategic move for people to say, okay, it's not human rights. Let's go with civil rights, or let's go with, farm worker rights or disability rights. But they're integrally connected. And I do think those people know. I mean, I've seen Dolores Huerta's speeches from the 1970s where she uses the term human rights. So people are working in these frameworks, but thinking strategically about what can work. But I think they're still using human rights framings, but maybe in the more public-facing, legislation discussions, they're calling it one type of right or another. And I think it's really limited progress. We can think about voting rights. Okay, that created some voting rights. We see that, being scaled back in recent years. But we're not talking about holistic human rights. And I think that has limited some of the progress. Maybe it wasn't tenable at that time to be able to talk about that because of those historical forces, and the kind of McCarthyism and the way that people were labeled as communists for using any such terms. But I do think the moment is right for us to really think about connecting struggles. And something that I've been sort of heartened by is, if you look at the principles of the Black Lives Matter movement, there are things around solidarity with other struggles. You see mentions of indigenous struggles. You see solidarity with Palestine. You see this kind of intersectional globalism kind of having a little bit more resurgence again in this moment as we see people connecting. The family of, I believe it was the young man, Michael Brown, who was murdered in Missouri, where a lot of Black Lives Matter protests, spurred. Afterwards, his family testified in front of the Committee Against Torture in Geneva about, the death of their son, people really thinking about what does globalism and what do these international frameworks mean in terms of struggles for justice, struggles for rights. So I think we're in a moment where some of that is coming back in, but I do think the US is woefully behind. I do think, we don't have any required human rights education. It's sort of opt-in. You see some public schools, some private schools doing it. California created, some new social science standards that had some mention of human rights, doesn't really come out fully in the textbooks that were developed around that. So it's really kind of watered down in this country for sure.
The Poor People's Campaign is an interesting example of trying to use that human rights language, I think, today. Mm-hmm. It's interesting you mentioned Robeson because not only is he a great hero of mine, but also a guy who was way ahead of his time with a universalist focus and was an anti-colonialist. And then, as you pointed out, suffered terribly in the 1950s. And Carol Anderson has done a great job documenting that sort of step back in the 1950s. Thanks for listening to Human Rights Education Now. Our next episode concludes our conversation with Monisha Bajaj, a leading scholar in the fields of human rights education and peace education. You can find additional information about this podcast series at www.hreusa.org. Each episode is available on the HREUSA podcast page, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Player FM, and Deezer. It will soon be available on YouTube and SoundCloud. You can also download each episode as an MP3 file. If you have questions or comments about this podcast, send them to Christy@hreusa.org. That's KRISTI@hreusa.org. Our podcast team includes host and producer Bill Fernikes, executive producer Christy Rodelius-Palmer, editor Elizabeth Schwab, sound designer and project manager Sabrina Sanchez, communications and public outreach coordinator Jessica DeRubin, and production coordinator Jasmine Chizu Gota. The Human Rights Education Now logo was designed by Kim Peirre. Human Rights Education Now is a production of Human Rights Educators USA, a project of the Center for Transformative Action in Ithaca, New York.